Hey guys, we're continuing on with our study throughout Colossians, and today we'll be in Colossians chapter 1, verses 15 through 23. Quick note, if you're looking for a background to this letter and really a general overview and just kind of getting a running start, we'd refer you back to the first video that was put out last week. You can find that on our YouTube channel as well, because today we're going to get ready and just hop into these verses here. So again, background, big picture overview, you want to go check out the last video for that. But without further ado, let's hop into these verses, chapter 1, verses 15 through 23, and they read, "He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. And you, who were once alienated and hostile in mind, doing evil deeds, he is now reconciled in his body of flesh by his death, in order to present you holy and blameless and above reproach before him. If indeed you continue in the faith, stable and steadfast, not shifting from the hope of the gospel that you heard, which has been proclaimed in all creation under heaven, and of which I, Paul, became a minister." So, a lot to unpack here. This is a very, very big passage here. N.T. Wright and some other scholars have named this one of the most supreme passages in all of the New Testament, and really all of the Bible, in terms of who Christ is and what he is about. And so when we are coming to this passage here today, we need to understand we're dealing with a big boy passage. Now, obviously, every single passage in the Bible is important, but this one here today, in terms of answering questions, who is Jesus? What does that mean? And how important is he? This will hit that answer spot on. Now, we're not sure if Paul wrote this himself, or as some scholars believe that he borrowed it from a hymn of the day and just engrafted it in this letter. And so whether he wrote it himself or whether he borrowed it from someone else, the truths that are in here are substantial and they are hard-hitting. So let's unpack these and ask this question: what is this passage saying to us? Well, from the very get-go, we are told in verse 15 that Christ is the image of the invisible God. And that, as one scholar said, he is the fullest expression of this invisible God that we hear about and we read about in the Old Testament and the New Testament. If you'll recall throughout all of the Bible, if you're familiar with it, if not, that's okay, you will see in the Bible that no man can see God face to face. Even Moses, one of the big boys of the Old Testament, is not able to see God face to face. There are certain restrictions there because of his sinfulness. We see Isaiah in Isaiah 6 in the throne room vision. He's not even looking at God face to face. He walks into the presence of God, and even before he gets any closer, he falls on his face in terror and in awe of who this God is and how holy this God is. And so when people say, well, what does God look like? Or what does that mean about God? And how can we know God and all this? We know that we can know God through Christ, his earthly ministry here. What we see in the Gospels. This is why Paul says he is the image of the invisible God. That is, he is the fullest expression there. Goes on to say that he is the firstborn of all creation. This is a big part of this verse here. Why? Because there are a lot of people out there that will deny that Christ is God. In fact, they will say that Christ was created, that there was a time before Christ existed, and that Christ was created by God and sent to earth to be our Savior. This is an old heresy, goes by the name of Arianism. You can look it up. It's something that still persists today. We may not call it Arianism anymore, but there are people out there that will deny what we would say is the deity of Christ. And they will look to this verse and they will say, see, this is what we're talking about. He was created. He is the firstborn, right? Well, they are abusing that text and they are misunderstanding what Paul is saying there. Because in the Greek, what we know from this phrase, the firstborn of all creation, it can mean the biological firstborn. But the way Paul is using it here is that he's not referring to a biological firstborn child, but in the Old Testament, New Testament world, you could bestow, as the leader of your family, you could bestow the firstborn rights and rank and honor on a child of your choosing there. We see this again and again a lot of times throughout the ancient world. And so to sum it all up, what does it mean? It means that Christ was not created. He has always existed. But what Paul is saying here in this verse is that he holds the honor and the rank of the firstborn. And you say, well, why is he worthy to hold that? Well, not only is he the image of the invisible God, as we hear in verse 15, but through the next few verses, we are told that Christ is supreme over this creation from the beginning of creation until now, and he will be supreme over the new creation, that is the new heavens and the new earth that is to come later on. And so to unpack that, let's ask this question. What does it look like for him to be supreme? Well, one, he is the authority over all things. In fact, you hear this in this passage we just read. By him, all things were created. That is, he was present on the day of creation, on those days of creation, when God was speaking things into existence. As one scholar said, Christ was the instrument by which those things came about. This is why when you read John 1:1, it looks a lot like Genesis 1:1. John is pointing back to creation and saying, this Christ is the same Christ that was there in Genesis 1:1. So he's supreme over all creation. He's the author. He is the creator. He is the sustainer. You hear this as well in this passage when when Paul says that he holds all things together. That is, without Christ, everything that we know in the universe would disintegrate. Just let that blow your mind for a second there. To continue on, we are told as well that he is the head of the body, that is the church. And why is he qualified to be so? Well, he is the firstborn from the dead. What we're getting ready to celebrate on Easter, the resurrection of Christ, the only God-man who has been qualified to defeat death, defeat sin at the cross, and to rise again from the grave, the only one who has ever done that, qualifies him to be the head of the church. That is his bride. That is the universal church that exists here in this world today. The church, hopefully, that you're a part of, and the church that I'm a part of, that means that we look to Christ as the ultimate head there. He is well qualified. And it goes on to show us that Christ is the goal of all creation. And what does that mean? Well, it means that the goal is for God to be glorified. And for God to be glorified, we ask that question again, what does that mean exactly? Well, for God to be glorified, that means that all of creation, including humankind, are worshiping him and obeying him. And so this is the goal for your life and my life, for us to glorify God. And by doing that, I obey God and I worship God. But now there's a little issue here that Paul tells us about in verse 21. He says, and you who were once alienated and hostile in mind doing evil deeds. That is, on my best day, before I knew Christ, I was separated from him and I was only capable of evil things that were hostile to God. Now, that does not mean that I didn't do good deeds like help an old lady across the street or get her groceries out the car. But what it does mean is that outside of Christ changing my life, eternally speaking, that is forever speaking, my good deeds amounted to a hill of beans. That is nothing there. And so for me to obey and worship Christ, for me to obey and worship God, something had to change. And so we hear in verse 22 that Christ is now reconciled in his body of flesh by his death in order to present us holy and blameless and above reproach before him. To put it quite simply, because of Christ saving me, I am able to stand before God that I was once separated and guilty before. I am able to stand before him now as a Christian, righteous before him and blameless, not because of what I have done or my merit or my deeds, but because of the finished work of Christ on the cross and in the empty tomb there, him defeating death, defeating sin. So to draw this all together, what are some practical outworkings of this passage? We just blew through a massive passage in just a few minutes here. So let's talk about some ways that we can walk this out. Well, some questions we need to ask is, one, am I in awe of Christ? And I would encourage you, go back to especially verses 15 through 20 there. Do I view Christ the way that Paul puts him forth there? And if not, start to pray, Lord, change my heart so I really sit in awe of this Christ who holds all things together, who is supreme over everything, who is the goal of every single thing, who knows the depths of the universe and knows the depths of my individual life and still loves me even despite my massive failings in my life. That is a Christ I want to know. Am I in awe of that Christ? Am I worshiping that Christ as I should? Again, pray to God for him to turn your heart towards that type of outworking in your life. Secondly, here, with this, does my life look any different? It is clear in verse 21 and 22 and even into 23 that Paul is pulling on a difference that exists in the believer's life. That is, the former way of life should pass away. Before I knew Christ, I lived a certain way, but because Christ has saved me, my life and my choices, my thinking, what I watch, what I listen to, everything that I do in my life should start to look different. Doesn't mean I do those things perfectly, but what it does mean is consistently in my life, day after day, even if it's small baby steps, I'm growing to be more like Christ. And then lastly, I love the word that Paul uses in verse 23 when he says that you can remain steadfast. And how can you remain steadfast, especially in a time when we don't really know what's coming day to day with this whole coronavirus thing? Well, we can remain steadfast because our Savior never changes. He is still the same Savior that has been present even before this universe and galaxy was ever created. He was the same Savior then. He was the same Savior on the cross and in the tomb and afterwards leaving the empty tomb. He is the same Savior in 2020. He'll be the same Savior in 3020 if the Lord gives those years there. This Savior does not change. And so in an uncertain time with changing things all around us day after day, I can wake up every morning knowing that the Savior that I love and serve and worship and obey never changes. And so the last challenge I'll give you here, with it being Easter week, people are especially dialed in to more spiritual things and more spiritual conversations. Let me challenge you to share about this passage with a friend, with a coworker, with a family member. Let them sit and read about who this Christ is and watch how God will use that passage to begin to change their lives there. That's all we have for today. We'll be finishing out chapter 1, verses 24 through 29 next time. Hope to see you then.